Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, where we are now in our third season of helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchuk, dietitian, running coach, twin mom, and fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchuk Performance Nutrition, I've spent over a decade helping runners learn to fuel their bodies better, unlock their best running performances, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. This podcast is all about helping you become the very best runner you can be by teaching you the running-specific nutrition, training, and recovery strategies that you need to reach all your wildest health, fitness, and running goals. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, join me each week as I share my best advice, interview guest experts, and talk to everyday runners who are conquering their goals by tapping into the power of performance nutrition, with a side of some myth busting too. And if you're looking for even more tips, resources, and strategies for runners, you can find me on Instagram at Steph the Runner's Dietitian or by visiting www.stephanienatchuk.com. All right, let's dive into today's episode. Start today's episode, I just want to really quickly invite you to download my free fueling guide and strength training guides for runners. Currently available as a handy little bundle for you all in one at the link in the show notes. So just to give you more information, in this free fueling guide, you're going to find my top fueling tips for runners. As well, in there, I've put together some meal ideas and even a couple of recipes for your pre and post run fuel. We've also got some suggestions for what to fuel with during your run to make sure that you just have the best overall performance possible. If you've really been struggling to understand what to eat, when, where to start when it comes to supporting your running with better nutrition, this guide is here to help you kickstart your running journey. The other guide that I mentioned is my strength training guide for runners. We know that runners are notoriously bad at consistently getting their strength training in. So this guide includes both a PDF resource, it's got some tips, some guidelines, as well as a link to my series on YouTube where I walk you through all the exercises in this program, giving you some suggestions on proper form, how to modify if needed, how to progress things if needed. This is a really great beginner's guide to strength training for runners who want an effective but efficient full body workout that is going to support the key muscles and movements you need to run stronger and help stay injury free. So once again, both of these guides are available as a handy little bundle. So you just click on the link in the show notes, enter your email address once, and both of the free guides are going to get sent to your inbox right away. I really hope that you find these guides helpful and that they support you and your running goals in the most effective way possible. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, where I am very excited to be sitting down with a special guest, Coach Seth Funderberg, who is here to chat with all of us about tune-up runs and tune-up races and how you can really use them to your advantage to get you set up for success with your goal race. And so we've got tons of great stuff that we're going to talk about today in terms of like timing of your tune-up runs or races, how to schedule them, what you should do, some logistics involved. And I'm really excited for this conversation because it's a topic that we have not covered yet on the podcast. So thanks a lot, Seth, for being here today.
What a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having it.
All right, fantastic. So before we dive into all of the great conversation that we have planned here, tell us a little bit more about yourself, your business, how you got into running. Just like we want your origin story. Let's hear the whole thing.
Sure. Well, first off, thank you so much again. It's such an honor to be here. We share a common coaching background through USCA, so that's always a fun connect. I personally got into running at a young age. Started with middle school. I was encouraged by my coach to try out cross country and track. We had the fast Fridays or the running Fridays for PE, where we just kind of walk and jog around the track. And at that time, our school didn't have a program, and it was just a really gentle encouragement after, trying to win a pizza party of like, hey, when you graduate to high school, you should really look into running. This might be your thing. And so just really grateful for someone to push that way.
Okay,
And
so
so
hang
that's
on.
how I got into running.
We need to back up a little bit. So you got paid, you were a professional runner when you were in junior high because you got paid to run with pizza.
Listen, you got to take a deal when you see one.
I agree. I agree. I mean, man, if somebody wanted to pay me in pizza now, I probably would take it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We do love a good carb here.
Yes.
Yeah. So that middle school into high school journey was continued, all through high school and into the early college. Just again, more and more opportunities, meeting fantastic humans and more influential people who just continue to speak into the running career. And that's how I found myself thinking like, man, this is something I would really love to give back. And where we saw a need for young athletes is where I started at the high school level as a coach, and then progressing into like even bigger need through runBMT, the company that I own now, working with anywhere from the high school athlete all the way up to the elite level athlete, which includes our like front or back of the pack for your local racing scene as well.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. And so tell us a little bit more about your coaching company, Run BMT, you said it's called, and kind of how you started that, how you decided to kind of go out on your own and do your own thing versus maybe working for somebody else. What led you to entrepreneurship?
For sure. For sure. Thanks for the space. So Run BMT, we started in 2016, and it evolved out of this need for something just a little bit more intimate and a little bit more personal than what we had available to us at that time, right? So we're a running collective based out of Orlando, Florida. Again, our whole goal is to create and to continue to foster a sense of community. So that's where we're pillared in, but we operate all of our programming and all of our thought process through a performance lens. So whether you identify as like a front of the pack runner, a new to running, maybe you ran in high school and have been out of the scene for a long time, we wanted to give you that opportunity to be partnered up with someone and a community that's going to propel you and just give you the right tools in the toolbox.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's, we've seen in the last couple of years, sort of in the post lockdown era of people really craving like getting out of the house. I mean, me as a coach, I do spend a lot of time on my clients with Zoom, but it's wonderful when they have those local spaces they can go to connect with other runners in person and just kind of have that community atmosphere. Cause that's what running is really about. But if you only get that opportunity to kind of like see other runners out there doing their thing, like on race day, you're kind of missing out a little bit, I think, on some of the value of being a runner.
I would absolutely agree because race day is such a unique experience in the stratosphere of running that you're only getting like kind of like you said, one flavor of the running. And I think I would maybe complement that with if you ran competitively for a while, there's also this educational piece, especially post lockdown as people move back into the like community swing of being active, being outside and running. You think about how much skill set you learn to like shoot a basketball or to learn a new sport or to start a new job.
Yeah.
But how much conversation did we put aside to talk about the sport of running and all the nuance that comes into movement and movement patterns and good mechanics and footwear and the things that we take for granted having been in the sport for so long? Just a
Yeah.
great opportunity to share and to bring people along with us.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I know like just in my city, they'll have like a global running day run and like 100 people will turn up for some of these like, sort of the big running events. It's really, really cool to see how people just like come out for this stuff in a way that I don't know we would have before lockdowns. Like I think we have an appreciation for like getting out and connecting and going to events in person that we sort of took for granted before.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think we had the pleasure of hosting the trials this last big year, 2024. The Olympics were right here in our backyard. And
Hmm.
I think to your point, what we saw is just so many people excited to be out and to be in sport. And then just the agreeability, right, across the span of like what running could be and the opportunity to get involved was just
Yeah.
really phenomenal to see.
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. So yeah, so we had talked a little bit back and forth, about running clubs and that sort of thing when we were kind of creating our plan for this podcast episode. But one of the topics that we really wanted to sort of dial in on was this concept of tune-up runs and tune-up races. And so if you're listening to this episode as someone who has no idea what we are talking about, that is fine because we're here to give you all the information you need about this. So Seth, can you just like define that for anybody listening who who may not be familiar with the concept or the term of a tune-up run or a tune-up race?
Absolutely, absolutely. In our cohort, we kind of use it just strictly as tune up, but a good like Reader's Digest version of this could sound like a dress rehearsal, right? Especially when you think of the performance lens of it all. You're signing up for your first half marathon. It's new to you, right? There's all this nuance, and so a dress rehearsal, a simple opportunity to kind of practice everything that you've learned along the way, and just to you get the feels out. It's just an excellent opportunity.
Yeah, totally. And I think too, for runners who are running longer distances, you don't get that many opportunities to race that distance. Like if we're talking, say, marathoning, I mean, you should not be running a marathon every couple of months. People do it, but you shouldn't. And so if you're trying to really gain experience and become a confident marathoner, then you want to have more races under your belt throughout the year than just, that one marathon that you might run every like 12 to 24 months.
Yeah, yeah. And an easy way to pair this up with so much information that you share so well is if you're running a longer distance race, one of the areas of interest that you're probably going to run into is how do I fuel for this race? And so having a tune-up gives you an opportunity to have a low stakes experience where you can practice your newest fueling strategy, right? Maybe you're trying gels for the first time, or you're trying a new bar or a new sports drink. Then this is a chance for you to explore how it sits in your stomach and to work on the timing and just to get a opportunity to get into like the mental piece of racing as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And like I can just, I'm just thinking of a personal story here. There was one half marathon that I had done, and it was happened to be a very cold day. So it was in early May, but it was one of those early May days that it was like basically freezing outside, and it was like kind of snowy, and it was just not a nice day. And I was using like chews, like the Honey Stinger chews that day,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to get that package open with my cold hands, and then the chews were freezing, and I'm like, okay, so this is not something that works when the weather is cold. There we go, good learning opportunities. I'm not going to do that next time. And this is kind of what we're talking about, is just, yeah, you're not then doing it on the day of your goal race, this really high stakes event, but you're able to practice that and know maybe what works and what doesn't.
That's the perfect example. And this is how I can tell we're not in Florida because a day in May here in Orlando is polar opposite, right? It's going to be hot and humid, and you're looking for anything you can get down. Um, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
for sure. Well, and you know what's crazy about, so I'm in Winnipeg, and so we're right in the middle of central Canada. And so, I mean, basically on any given day throughout the year, you could have like a 30 to 40 degree temperature swing from year to year. Like it wouldn't be unheard of to have it be like freezing or plus 30. You just don't know what you're going to get.
That's fair. That's
Yeah.
fair. And that's a
So,
great example of why a tune-up makes a lot of sense, right? You've spent the last, let's just say 6 months building for this big event, right? You've told all your friends, you told all your family, and let's just say, for the example that you're using, you've been using the Honey Stinger Chews, which is a phenomenal piece of nutrition, right?
yep.
It's what you've been practicing with. It sits well, but all of a sudden you find yourself, you realize you've been using it on the treadmill indoors and it's gone down perfectly. Now
Yep.
you're outside, it's freezing. Those are blocks, right? You've never had to open the package with the gloves on, right?
Yeah.
The chews are now rock hard. It's throwing your whole race, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. So on that note, we've talked about like the fueling strategy being really important as part of the champ race, and hydration and gear too, right? Like maybe you bought a new vest, or you haven't had a chance because you've been running on the treadmill a lot, or something like that. Is your pacing strategy, or your maybe goal pace for your ultimate, the race that you're planning for here, is that part of your tune-up planning, or do you like to use it as really something that's more related to like those other logistical factors?
That's a fantastic question. And for us, it's going to come down trial by trial, person by person. And I think maybe three big pieces that you might look at could be environment, nutrition, and timing, right? If we're going to talk about like key things to focus on during a
Yep.
tune-up. And so, depending on how far out the tune-up is or how many tune-ups you might have the opportunity to race, we might look strictly at environment. And what I mean by that is if your race is really hilly, say you're running the half marathon and it's got like a good chunk of elevation on it, then our goal might be to find a smaller tune-up race that's going to give us some feelings that are similar to our half marathon, like, oh, like this is what I feel like on the hills, and this is my chance to get that stress in the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if it's a longer race, then yes, we might strictly look at it for nutrition or for gear. And then to answer your question, in totality, we might look at it for pacing, and that depends on how far out it is. If you have a few races that you're looking to get, some good stress and to kind of try a good effort on to
Mm-hmm.
see like how your progress is coming along, then we might look at it for that, right? And that usually gives us about 6 weeks is kind of a sweet spot, I think, for most athletes to have a final tune-up before the big dance, right? Where you get to dress the part, lay out all your gear, see how the nutrition feels at effort, and then go out and give it an honest shake,
Yep.
right? And then that could do a couple things for us. One, it gives us the mental reciprocity for race day, right? Like, oh, I didn't realize I was really nervous. Good. That's the check-in I need, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
it puts us in a space mentally where we normally don't get in practice either, right? Like running a hard 10K alone on a practice day, we're not going to go quite to the well the way we would on a 10K on race day, right? And so that's a good practice as well. Like, what am I capable of? How did it feel? And you take that emotional bandwidth and partner it against what your expectations might be for your goal half marathon or your goal marathon. And you can work that up or down depending on your distance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you kind of touched on this, and that was the next sort of topic that I wanted to uncover was that ideal timing of like how we fit these tune-ups into a training schedule. Like you had mentioned, 6 weeks is sort of ideal. Now, for people who are listening, if you are running your first marathon, and you're building up your volume towards running your very first marathon, then to run, a half marathon and maybe include like, goal pace, like that might be a lot for someone who's running their very first race. So again, it kind of comes down to, like you said, that individual and maybe setting some specific individualized goals for both the timing and the things that we're looking at for that tune up, because it may just be, just getting some race experience under your belt so that you're not as nervous on the day of the marathon.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much to take in, whether it's marathon, 10K, 1 mile, 5K, the experience of the race, right? Like, let's say you're running a track race instead, kind of figuring out the whole prep phase. Like, what does my timing look like to getting to the track and getting my bib, and then like
Yeah.
what lane am I in, and is it going
Yep.
to be crowded or not, and the travel piece of those are all part of the
Mm-hmm.
environment
Mm-hmm.
cues that you want to know, right? The last thing you want to do is show up to race day already behind the 8 ball because you were struggling to find parking and you
Yeah.
realize you still need to go to the bathroom and you haven't even gotten to your bib yet.
Yeah. Yeah. You forgot your banana in the car. I don't know.
There's so many things that could go wrong. So that dress rehearsal is just a good chance to kind of get your timing down for yourself as well. Not only just the timing for the actual race and the effort piece, but the prep piece as well.
Yeah, yeah. And looking at it from that lens of like a formal sort of race being your tune up versus just like you had said, sort of creating that environment and sort of doing it, say, on your own to an extent, what would be some of the biggest differences and maybe pros and cons of each option? Because, like racing costs money. And depending on where you
Of course.
live, there may not be that many events with ideal timing in your area. So it might require a lot of extra like logistics and travel and expense to go and do another race when you're already kind of planning and preparing for one. So I guess what we're trying to say, what I'm trying to say anyway, is that it doesn't always have to be like, okay, I'm registering for another event and doing another like thing that's costing me potentially hundreds of dollars. But we can set up that tune up run environment and just sort of do that dress rehearsal on our own. So, what would be like, yeah, some pros and cons of either option there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll use our example for that we run into pretty commonly here in Florida. If you're running a fall marathon, you're building during the summer.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, because it's summer, there's not a lot of tune-up opportunities. So if you're racing a fall marathon, you're really kind of at the mercy of the season, which means maybe a bunch of local 5Ks,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no good tune-up opportunity. There's no 10 milers, there's no half marathons
Yep.
on a local level that you can jump into. And then if you're in the same situation that you're kind of speaking of, like, what do I do about if I'm a little bit more financially savvy and I need to like kind of think about where I'm spending my time and energy, then a time trial might be a really effective way of getting that done. And I think some of the pros of that is you can create your own timeline. You can create your own distance. You can set some different parameters on it. I think maybe some of the cons would be you're not quite tapping into that race experience.
Hmm.
So you're still missing out on like some of the crowd and some of the timing, like learning the travel piece and the packing piece. But what it might do is it might take some of the stress off as
Hmm.
well,
Hmm.
right? Not
Yeah.
everyone responds to race day. You hear a lot of athletes talking about race day anxiety and race day nerves. And so moving it out of a race situation and putting it into a more controlled time trial can soften a lot of that nerve and a lot of that anxiety and just gives you a little bit more more tangible data for that moment.
Yep.
And so I think that could be a really positive uh, note as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, like, if you are someone who has quite a bit of race experience, like, you've been running for a long time, then setting up your own tune up run that it's not a formal race and you're doing it as like a time trial and you're sort of practicing or certain things on your own terms. I think that is really valuable to kind of know how your training is going. You're taking out some of those race day factors that might inhibit your performance. Like you can kind of make it just what you want it and need it to be. But if a huge piece of this is that you need to get more races under your belt to have less anxiety about racing, then doing your own time trial is, not necessarily going to solve that problem or fit that bill.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that kind of leans on the season, right? You have these seasons where you're racing a lot and you're really sharpening the axe as far as like kind of getting that experience. But then you have these seasons where you kind of made the note, you're like, I've got a good bit of race experience under my belt. It's less about being at the show and really honoring my next goal. Maybe that's more of a performance goal, is time or placement. So you might really, like you said, curate the space where you're like, all right, today, for example, the workout's just going to be 10K at steady state, and my goal is to hit X minute miles for each split, right? And if I can do that, then that shows that my training is on track and I'm kind of on par for my long-term goals this
Yeah.
season.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because we have the exact opposite situation of you in Florida with it being so hot and humid in the summer that it's like, gets pretty dangerous to be having these big kind of long endurance events in those months. We're sort of the opposite in the winter time where you don't get a lot of longer events between, basically October until the end of February. You're not going to find anything here longer than a 10K. Maybe
Mm,
there were some trail races. I don't know them all. I mean, I'm not like the race expert or anything, but you just see mostly shorter events, 5Ks and 10Ks here locally, just because it can be so extremely cold. That of course also quite dangerous and hard to train, when you're someone who doesn't want to get out there when it's minus 40 potentially. So we sort of kick off our season February, but it's literally called the hypothermic half marathon that we have up here. And then, kind of May is when things really start up.
yeah, Stephanie, I love that example. I'm a reverse workshop that, right? Because if you're a newer athlete, you're getting excited about running. Your friends are like, "Hey, let's do this half marathon," right? And we'll use the one that you're talking about in February. If that's like kind of the first race on your radar, then you can look at your tune-up as a good litmus of if this is something that you might train for, right? Because if there's not a lot of space to practice, or if there's not a lot of space to gain experience or to dress rehearse into your race, then that might deter you from kind of the timing that you're looking at, right? And
Yeah.
so we use that example even in Florida. We're like, hey, like if this is your first marathon, just so you know, like there's not a lot of races to be had. And you might say the same, like, hey, the weather's going to be really dreary here. There's not a lot of good races, and the training's going to be challenging. So we're not going to hit our splits the way you normally would, and you're not going to wear the same gear that you normally would for race season. It might behoove us, just given the stress test for if there's good tune-ups and good training, to shift your season, right?
Yep.
And so the tune-up kind of works both ways. You can find a good A race and then find a good tune-up to complement it, or you might look, oh, there's not a lot of good tune-ups. This isn't a good A race to pivot or to
Yes.
pick. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, and for sure, I've done this hypothermic event a couple of times, and some years we don't have a lot of snow, and it's like pretty smooth sailing. Sidewalks are clear. You can, it's a good like quality event to like test your fitness. Other times, we're under 3 feet of snow and you're like hiking
Mm,
through the snow. Like you're not even running for half of this. You're just kind of, trudging along trying to get through it. So, you just don't know what you're going to get. But you feel as though someone who is very much like a recreational level runner, like someone who isn't competitive, not sort of the front of the packer, do you still feel like there's a lot of value to be had in tune-ups, or is it sort of as the kind of stakes are higher with the maybe level of athlete that you're coaching, it's something that does become more and more key because some of those small details are just that much more important?
That's a great question. And I think we talk about this a lot on some of the long runs with the fellows. And I think that there is a trade. Like if you are racing so much that you kind of lose sight of the performance goal. But I think it's crucial on both sides of the coin, whether you're more of a recreational and just starting versus more of a like, I'm here to perform and I'm here to find fitness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's this so much tangible data that you can translate from one to the other,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, like, for my runners who, again, I'm usually talking about marathoners just because marathoners race so infrequently. People who are new to marathoning and maybe are new runners who don't have years of doing other distances before they get into marathoning, like, I just want them to feel more comfortable in a race environment. So signing up for
Hmm.
some 5Ks, some 10Ks, and then, yeah, some halves and stuff too, but really kind of getting into those 5s and 10Ks along the way as part of their training just really helps them to be comfortable in that race environment.
100% correct. And
Yeah.
I think you brought up a good point. As coaches, we've noticed there's this new season in racing, right? There's this romance for the marathon,
Yeah.
where historically you might have seen more athletes who have been in the 5K, 10K, even half marathon season for a little bit longer, so they have that experience already.
Mm-hmm.
But now what we're seeing is that shift where marathon is kind of the target distance even on
Yep.
the news side
Yep.
of running culture and run community, run club. So there is kind of this new pressure of, okay, like we're talking about it all the time in our programming. Hey, let's find a tune-up because you need the experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk specifics because, the timing and the distance of a tune-up will vary, of course, depending on the distance that you are, like the distance of your goal race. So let's kind of go like maybe shorter distances like track, 5K and up. So what would be the ideal timing and distance for somebody racing, doing something like 5K or shorter?
Sure. So 5K and shorter, I think you get away with a much shorter tune-up space,
Hmm.
right? And that might fall itself into a time trial or a really hard workout could even function in this space, right? Where you're
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
like testing the strengths. So you might say something as wild as 10 days out.
Hmm.
So let's say we were running a 5K. We program classically like a really hard effort at a much shorter distance, say 2K
Hmm.
or 1 mile just to turn the legs over so there's no shock in the system either, right? Because that
Yep.
race is so short and so fast, you know, if you don't give them that opportunity to kind of see what it feels like to go hard, then when the gun goes off for the 5K for the first time, there's kind of that shock and that panic, right? And we
Yeah.
don't want that to be your first experience. So we try and load something about 10 days out just to give them a little reciprocity and a little taste.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And then like we're going to talk through all of these, but like just to sort of contrast that on the flip side, if you said, "Oh, I'm going to run like a half marathon 10 days before a marathon," every coach would be like, "No."
Please don't do
Yeah.
that. Yeah, you're gonna totally feel it in your legs. Exactly.
Exactly, exactly. So and just for people who are listening, like so much of this depends a lot on your race distance. And I think too, like when I'm reading books written by coaches, right? There are so many more coaches out there. And I'll say like professional coaches who kind of work in that like collegiate sort of space, like that are just working with a lot of track athletes, that we have to remember that that is it's a different sport than distance running. Like it's almost like, it's hard to even talk about them in the same sort of breath because they're just so completely different in our approach with things. But so what about for a 10K? So what would be, kind of ideal timing and distance if someone has a goal race of a 10K?
Sure. And before I answer that, I think I'd love to tack on to your last sentence. If you're
Yeah.
a listener here, I think my encouragement would be there's so much chatter that leads to this part of the conversation. Like, are we training through the race? Like, what's our goal? Is
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
just experience or is it for performance? And with that, you get a lot more nuance. But if we're sticking to kind of just a classic chatter, then I think a 10K opens up the door, obviously a little bit more space. You might want a little bit more bandwidth between the race and your last tune-up, and it might be as big as a 5K, and that might
Hmm.
again look like 3 to 5 weeks out.
Yep.
And that again also depends on your level of fitness. So if it was like myself and I'm looking to run a really important 10K, then I might want to schedule something far enough out where I don't have to taper in and out of the tune-up race,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Because that's part of the tune-up, right? Is getting the race feels, and a real race field usually has a taper.
Hmm.
But I also want to make sure that I'm not taking away from my training cycle as well,
Yeah.
right? So that's something to consider. And so for the 10K, it might be as short as 3 weeks in the way that you may not run anything substantial. It might again just be 3K just to work on pace. Or it might be something far out enough where it's not in the final performance cycle. It might be another 6 weeks.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. So then what about for our, 10 miler half marathoners? What would be the ideal kind of distance and timing of a tune-up run for them?
Yeah, that's tough, right? The half marathon is such an interesting
It
distance.
is, yeah.
You might, because the tune up for that, like in a perfect world, you're like, oh, I'll run, 10 to 15K. But
Hmm.
in road racing, that's such a unicorn of a distance to find a quality 10K or a 15K even just
Yeah,
doesn't happen as organically as a 5K. So,
yeah. It's sort
unfortunately,
of
I
an
think you're probably going to
afterthought.
get
It's like,
stuck with it just a quality 5K.
yeah. Well, they have a 5K and they have a half marathon. And oh yeah, we'll throw a 10K in. It's part of it, but it's usually not like, this is a 10K race.
hmm hmm So I'll share something that we do in our program. A lot of times we'll split the day over a race. And so if we're tuning up for a half marathon, maybe 3 to 5 weeks out, we'll say find a local 5K and let's make it a workout. That way you
Hmm.
can still dress the part, you can learn the timing, you can practice your nutrition, you can get out and get a hard effort, so you might warm up 3 to 4 miles and then split your 5K right in the center and
Yep.
then cool down another 3 to 4 miles. So you're still getting the volume that you need.
Yep.
You're not coming out of your training cycle as far as like the taper,
Yep.
and you can keep moving, but it does give you a good stress test as well.
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. All right, and then our marathoners. So I know that a big, as we mentioned, marathoning has gotten tremendously, tremendously popular in the last couple of years, with events selling out and filling up like more than we've ever seen before. And so, if someone has a marathon, kind of on their calendar for this year, what is the ideal timing and duration of when they should do, a tune up or maybe a couple of tune ups over the course of marathoning? I mean, there's probably a point at which we would say, too many, that's too much tune up. You've had enough.
Sure, sure. This is probably the best part of the equation, right? Because the marathon is so wild, it's so big, and it demands so much bandwidth.
Yeah.
And so maybe two lines of thought. If you're really looking to like perform, right? You're kind of like stuck on this top tier of running, then the tune-up is probably a good solid A minus or B plus race, right? You're really looking to kind of check in and see how everything feels. You
Yeah.
you really want to get that quality moment. If this is your first marathon, then you're right. You might end up running kind of a myriad of races to prep, right? Because there's just so much unknown to you in this space. And
Hmm.
so you might use a half marathon strictly as a long run, and it's not even a real tune up in the way that you're putting performance in it, but you are
Yep.
definitely, hey, like how did it feel? Like that's the longest you've raced in a group before. Like that was
Hmm.
a solid long run. Like how did nutrition go? And
Yep.
what are the shoes feeling like these days? And
Yep.
like, did you practice getting water on the course? Because you're definitely going to have to do that in the marathon. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it, so that all changes when you start saying marathon, right? It's just like this whole collective of information and time and practice that comes into it.
Yeah.
So to answer the question, for a performance standpoint, this is where my 6 week number really comes home because again, you don't want to be so close that you're still recovering or putting your your peak performance in the half,
Yep.
right? Like I think that's a mistake we make, right? You're like, oh, I'm racing, Boston, so I'm going to do this 15K or this half marathon, like 4 weeks out, and then you never quite recovered. Like you put your best running in that race,
Yep.
and then you're still kind of feeling off for the marathon.
Hmm.
Where if you put it a little bit farther out, then maybe it becomes like 2 cycles, right? And you can kind of build up to that first race, check in, see how things are going, and then you have so much time before your key race that you can adjust, sit down and pivot, right? And so that's one way to look at it. And then the other way would be, on the soccer scale of, okay, like I'm gonna try and get 4 events in my big build just to kind of like work my volume up. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, and again, just for anybody listening, like you can see that there's a huge array of timing and distances and things that we might want to incorporate. So I think the big take home here is that it really depends on you, your goals, your running experience, and the purpose of that tune up, right? Like, why are we doing it? Are we checking in with how training is going, looking at performance indicators? Are we trying a new fueling strategy and we want to just make sure that that's all good? Are we just trying to get some race experience under our belts, logistics of having to park, having to maybe drop your bag, get in line for the porta potties, find your corral before everything like what is it that we're trying to do with the tune up? And that will really give us a lot of indication as to the timing and maybe the distance that we're going to select.
Yeah. You mentioned something in the very last piece of that chatter, right? And I think this is a really cool take home for a lot of our listeners in the way that most of us are not professional marathoners.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll use a key measure, for example. Let's say the gun goes off at 9 for your top athletes. If you're an everyday runner, you're likely not in the top corral, which means you're in corral D or F or J. There's a good chance that your race isn't going to start for another 2 to 3 hours
Mm-hmm.
by the time you cross the line. So a good example of like what a tune-up would look like is, oh, like, hey, like you split this half marathon with some distance on either side, and now you got to kind of practice the timing of everything, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's just such a different experience than any other race that
Yeah.
you're going to be in.
Yeah.
We get that with Disney, with people here in Orlando are
Oh, yeah, I bet. I
waking up at
bet.
an ungodly hour just to run, and everything's shifted, right? So you
Yes.
practice that. You're like, hey, like let's get you in a race that's gonna feel kind of wonky on timing so that you can
Okay.
figure out what your stomach needs to do, you
Yeah.
know?
No, I love that. And actually, for anybody who's listening who wants to hear more about the I'm gonna absolute chaos of Run Disney events. Like that's the only way that I can put it. I actually did an episode with a physiotherapist. Her name is Ali Marty. She's a physiotherapist and run coach, and she specifically works with Run Disney runners and helps Run Disney runners get ready for all of the events, but like people who are doing dopey and stuff like that. So if you want to hear more about that, if that interests you, then definitely check out her episode was in season 2. I don't know which number it was, but it was closer to the end of season 2. But yeah, when I heard this is not something as a Canadian, like this isn't something that's like tremendously high on my radar. But when we sat down to do the episode and she was telling me some of these logistics, like you have to be like in your corral at like 2 or 3 in the morning or like 4 o'clock in the morning. You got to get up at like 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm like, oh my goodness, like that is wild.
It's a whole different race in and of itself. That's a whole experience just
Yeah.
there, the
Yeah.
Disney experience.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And then you sort of compare that to, like you said, some of the other world major events where you maybe aren't starting. Like I want to say, is it Chicago that like you don't start running until like 9 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning or something? Like you're running midday. Now it's in October, so it's not it may or may not be quite warm out that day, but for a lot of us, we're getting our long runs done in the early hours of the morning. So to be kind of pushing that back by 4 or 5 hours, that's a whole different thing that you really want to be practicing at some point during your training cycle.
Sure, sure, absolutely. I mean, I'll use my personal example. We went
Yeah.
to Berlin and raced this last fall, and it was a phenomenal experience. So, but the race didn't start till 9, and I'm
Okay.
fortunate enough to be in the front, right? So I'm starting at 9. However, there's the whole prep on that. You're like, oh, if you're a morning runner, like you're saying, and I've done most of my training at 6 a.m.,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then you've kind of woken up early, gotten your prep in, or maybe you preloaded the evening before to kind of help fuel into that morning. And now you're extending your run experience by a good couple hours,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And then you think about the people in the crowds behind us who are, to your point, starting at 10 or 11
Yeah.
by the time they cross the line. It's just everything shifts, right? And so if
Yeah.
you're traditionally a morning runner, then now you're a mid-morning runner. And that's
Yeah.
something to practice and to consider.
Yeah, exactly. And especially because you still had to wake up just as early to get down there. So
Hmm.
now, in terms of the timing of your fueling, right, you maybe ate your breakfast when you woke up like you normally do, but now you're not running for like 3 or 4 hours after you've woken up. In terms of your fueling plan and how you're going to manage that, what else you're going to bring with you to have a snack in the corral as you're kind of waiting around, like all of those things are just important pieces of this. That, yeah, when you have, especially, for your kind of local smaller race, this usually isn't a thing. This is more for those big major events with like tens of thousands of runners. Our local Manitoba Marathon, we still have like, thousands and thousands of people that come out. It's our big Boston qualifier here. But like you can kind of walk up. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this publicly. You can kind of roll up like 5 minutes before the gun's going off. You'll be fine. You just need enough time to use the bathroom, but like no one, the corrals are not closing and not letting you in if you're not there early enough.
That's so funny. But that's still a great example, right? Like if we're using your big local race, right? You think of just about how many people are there. And like you said, you're still waking up early,
Yeah.
right? So if I'm talking as a coach and working with an athlete in the local area, maybe you and I are sharing an athlete, then we're going to talk a lot about, hey, your tune-up might look like an afternoon or evening race.
Yeah.
In the way that that's going to shift your practice, you're going to have to try and learn how to fuel for the day and like learn a different timing. Now for the first time, you've had to consider lunch
Yeah.
and like an afternoon race or timing. And that's going to better translate to what a bigger local race is going to feel like for you when you have to wake up at 5 and you ate then, and then you may not race for another 3, 4 hours. And so you
Yep.
at least have some experience of like, oh, this is what it feels like. And this is the timing of it all, right? This is all just stuff that's going to make your experience so much better and you feel so much calmer. And you have so much more data to translate over not only this season, but the seasons to come as well.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. It's always that learning experience. So speaking of learning experiences, because, we would be remiss if we did not talk about some of the biggest mistakes that we see runners making with these tune-ups. So what are some of the big things that you think that runners get wrong when it comes to their tune-ups?
Ooh, that's a fantastic question. I think right off the bat, biggest mistake runners make in a tune-up race is they treat it like the A race, right? Like the goal was to learn and to practice and to experience.
Yeah.
And so Stephanie goes out for the Disney half marathon and she rips it. It's a fantastic race, but you've got a lot of energy coming off that because you treated it like your A race. So you either went too hard or let's just say it doesn't go well, right? Like
Hmm.
it was a little bit of a hard race, right? You got up early, your stomach didn't like really appreciate what you ate. Maybe you took a wrong turn somewhere and you come back and I can already tell in our athlete breakdown that you have a lot of things to say, right? Like the energy is low, the attitude's kind of sour. Why? Right? So we put ourselves in this funk. And now training for the next week is all about like, I need to redeem that run and I'm in a funk. And they have the only experience they've had going into their key race is this bad experience,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Because we didn't treat it for what the race was supposed to be. The race was supposed to be a practice event or a learning curve or an experience. And because you put it into this like performance bracket, this A race, now we've got all this energy that we have to like uncouple and unlearn for your key race,
Yeah.
right? Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that that just comes down to like understanding the goals and expectations of this. And just because we say the word race does not mean all out effort. In fact, rarely, it's not that often that a race is going to be like your all out max effort. That's just for goal races, not for every single event that you do.
Especially as we look at the longer distance races, right? If we're talking about marathons specifically, just because it's such the hot topic right now,
Yeah.
it doesn't do us a lot of justice to go out and, maybe race a 10K at 10K effort because that's not translating to our marathon effort. Now it's a great day to check fitness and we got some like maybe new shiny PRs and that's always exciting. That might
Yep.
be a confidence boost. But the trade-off of that is if I go out and I don't treat it as the tune-up I was supposed to, and I have a bad experience and I didn't PR, again, that was the last taste I had in my mouth before my marathon. So I didn't get the
Yes.
practice effort, right? Nutrition didn't stick because I was out of my zones.
Yeah.
And then, I had a bad race.
Yeah.
And so it's just it's a balance, right? It's always this juggle. So
Yeah.
that's a big no-no or thing that I see athletes struggling with when we talk about tune-up.
Totally, totally. And I think that this next kind of question, we were talking about sort of mistakes, and the next question that I wanted to talk about was like, injury risk and sort of injury prevention in this space. And, I think you've probably already answered that with just not going out for that all out effort, and sort of making sure that it's um, intelligently worked into your training plan.
Mm.
But yeah, if you've got any other sort of advice or details to share about that, like how can an athlete use these tune-up races or a time trial as a way to tick off all of these boxes, kind of check the things we want to check on, practice things we want to practice, without them then getting some like last minute injury that we're now having to like try and plan around and rehab for as they get ready for their actual goal race.
That's fair. That's fair. And it's so tricky, right? Because it could happen anywhere and anytime.
Fair.
Uh,
Yes. Yes.
which is fair, right?
Yeah.
It's fair. I think that's the hardest part about marathon is you could have done everything right. You get on race day and you're like, well, I stepped in a pothole, so I guess that's that. But to answer your question, I think the encouragement I would have would be to take a macro lens to the cycle so that you can make sure that these key moments, these tune-up races, make sense on both sides. We used that example earlier, like if I'm running a marathon, then maybe a 10 mile or a half marathon is a good example. And then you work backwards from the timeline of, oh, like my race is in April. There's not a lot of opportunities for me to practice or to tune up here, or the weather's going to be X and Y. Maybe I'll look at a different race so that my tune up opportunities give me more chances to be successful,
Hmm.
right? And that works on both ways, right? As you build up to a race or decide a race, or maybe you work backwards, you're already kind of locked in on the race. And now you have to figure out like, are tune-ups the way for me, or am I going to time trial?
Yeah.
Like we talked about that earlier. And so I think that would be my encouragement is use a macro lens so that you're not forcing efforts or forcing workouts where they're not going to gift you what you need to be successful on the day that matters, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Race day.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, I've talked about this on a couple of other episodes of just keeping in mind that we are building up and planning for the race. So like doing things in training that are going to take away, and maybe people do these things so they don't realize that it's going to take away from their race day performance or experience. But we often will lose sight and do things in training to do them in training, and then we're not leaving enough kind of on the table for the race experience that we're looking for. And we have to always keep in mind like what's our ultimate goal here, and do things that are going to get us closer to being able to reach our goal, whether it's a PR or not. Like it's not about that. It's about, you know, working towards something and doing everything that you can to achieve it. And again, just it being strategic about those things.
I can't help just thinking about your specialty, and the thing that's coming to my mind is nutrition, right? Thinking about how many people will finish like a 10-mile run or like a 90-minute run. And you might ask them, hey, like, how did the fueling go? And they're like, oh, well, I didn't take anything.
Yeah.
And you're like, but why? And they're like, well, it was only 90 minutes or like, X time and I felt good. And you're like,
Yeah.
that's great. I'm so happy that you felt good. That's great. That's
Yeah.
great news. Let's start there. But we're tuning up for what? Like we're practicing for marathon, and like I really, really don't want you to get 90 minutes into your key event without having taken any nutrition, right? I'm sure that's a
Yes.
conversation you've had with at least one athlete.
Well, exactly. And we're going off topic here, but we always do. You're getting me fired up here, Seth. You see such a push, in some circles toward, training low, right? Training without fuel or even without hydration sometimes, which I'm like, okay, listen, that's just a whole other level of stupid. But training with as little resources as possible going in, and then trying to pull all of these things out and doing all of these things for the race. And I think that if you are a very, very experienced runner, your gut is trained, you've been doing this for years, if not decades, you know what works for you, you know your body, then yeah, sure, maybe we can get away with specifically training low to try and get some adaptations of maximizing muscle glycogen stores, et cetera. And then just, fueling and having it be like rocket fuel on the day of the race. But for all of us who don't have decades of running and racing and gut training experience under our belts, there is no value whatsoever in not training with anything. And I mean like everything from logistics of like opening packages. What's the weather like? Can you do that with gloves on if it's cold outside? Having to slurp down a gel if you've never done that before when you're running, like, whew, that's an experience. So to do it without hydration without fueling and then think you're going to just do that on the day of your race and it's all going to be fine. No. Listen, it is,
No, no.
like you need, I always think there's value in fueling, and I always think there's benefits performance wise. I understand why some people, after a long time of having a lot of experience, maybe want to try something different, and that's a conversation they have with their coaches and professionals. But for the vast 99% of us runners out there is only value for performance and for training quality, race day performance and training quality on your day-to-day runs in fueling and hydrating during. So there, off my soapbox.
100%.
Thank you for listening
Listen,
for my
I'll
TED
hold
Talk.
that box for you all day. Let's go.
So actually that's a really good segue. I wanted to talk a little bit about recovery and kind of get your thoughts and your perspective on recovery from these tune-up races. So we talked about like timing and how you kind of might do a little a mini taper, we'll call it, a small taper going in, and then, you want to time it so that you're not then having to like taper and then you're too close and you don't have time for like other training runs that need to happen in between. So the timing is key. But let's talk about recovery from these time trials or tune-ups and how those, having a good recovery strategy obviously can be helpful, or maybe how not having a recovery strategy can now detract from that goal race performance.
Sure. And this is tricky because this is going to lean heavily on the athlete and the athlete experience level, right?
Yeah.
Are we training through the race? And sometimes you nail it, and unfortunately, sometimes we just don't, right? We're a little too deep in the paint, and now you realize you're like, hey, the load was too heavy. We didn't recover well enough.
Yeah.
But to get into it, you might say something like, and this is a conversation we have a lot on our long runs. And I'm going to use the marathon example again because the tune-up, the half marathon being ideal or something close to that, 15K maybe, you say something like, yeah, we want to recover off that. Let's just say the effort was hard. Like you're really getting into it. If you go 6 weeks out, that's enough time. And I'll use that kind of timeline to paint the picture. If you go 6 weeks out, then maybe you don't taper into that particular event,
Mm-hmm.
a soft, micro taper, just a
Yeah.
few days
Yeah.
to feel kind of fresh. You really push the envelope. That now gives you enough time to come out of that to recover adequately. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe you take a down cycle, like a down week after that race experience. And then you can use that down week to polish up the other things. Like, am I getting enough sleep? Am I cross training? Am I like journaling? Am I, like looking at the things that I've like let collect dust over the last 6 weeks in preparation for this event?
Yeah.
I always joke with our athletes, like, go schedule all your doctor's appointments and get your car tuned up and this and that
Yeah.
during this time, right?
That's,
Because you're not going to do it the
yes,
week of the marathon.
totally. Water your
And so
plants.
water your plants, water yourself. And so 6 weeks, peak little effort, little down week as a tune up. And maybe that down week just looks like no hard workouts. You're still getting a little bit of volume, so you're still building towards your A goal.
Yep.
But that's a great way of kind of looking at it, right? Like if I use the tune up correctly, then it kind of builds in this organic stepping stone in my training cycle to just gently reset, right? And I think that's one of the gifts and joys of having a good tune up race. It forces a little part in your training cycle so that you don't get injured in their cycle. Because if you just gone 15 weeks hard in the paint, you've increased your volume, you've layered on the strength, you've layered on the workouts, and then you get, 10 days out from your key race and you realize you're like, man, I'm cooked. I've just gone too hard, right?
Yeah.
And so a tune up, kind of reverse engineering your question, a tune up is a great way to build organically a recovery cycle into your training so that we
Mm-hmm.
don't get hurt for our main
Yeah.
event. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. And it's like, I think this is where there's just so much value in coaching for runners who have goals for themselves. The internet is full of training plans and full like free training plans, probably really good free training plans, right? And if you're just getting something like that and you see on that training plan that there's a tune-up race suggested for a certain week before your marathon, but you don't have any context or any information about like, what are you supposed to be doing during that race? How are you managing yourself before and after? Why is the volume lower the week after that tune-up race? You might be thinking like, well, that's crazy because all I've seen is, building my volume this whole time. So I should do more than what the training plan calls for because I can, or I have before in previous weeks.
Hmm.
Having someone that you're at least checking in with semi regularly about your training, I just think that it's so helpful.
You're not wrong. You're absolutely right. And I think to your point, being a coach yourself, it goes both ways, right? A training plan could be perfect in theory, but it doesn't account all the other things we've talked about for how they got to that tune-up race. Like, does it fit your season? Does it fit your seasonality, right?
Yeah.
Are
Yep.
you hurt? Have you
Yeah.
done any nutrition before, right? So
Yeah.
they're like, yeah, you should do a tune-up X weeks out. And you're like, dude, I'm in the middle of a blizzard. Like, this is not happening.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Now I got to fly down to Florida to go do this tune-up race
do the
that might.
Disney, got to
Yeah.
come do the Disney race.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, in practice, obviously, working with tons of athletes of all different distances and levels and everything like that. How do you see these tune-up races kind of in real life helping runners with their confidence leading into the race? Because I mean, that's really the goal, right? Is that this is going to help you prepare for race day. And so what have you kind of seen in sort of real life and how that kind of works out with your clients?
Sure, sure. That's a fantastic question. And you're right. That is a big part of the tune-up race is to have that organic check-in. And I think as a coach, that's just invaluable to us. It just gives us a really good pause to, lean in and be like, well, John, tell me, man, how are you doing? Either a great day in the office and we talk about all the, we sing praise about all the good things you did.
Yep.
And it also builds confidence from your athlete to you as the coach. They're like, man, I never knew I could do it. I just came off this big PR. I'm so ready,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
right? And then the trade could also sound like, well, John, talk to me, man. You had a really rough day in the office, right? And that's equally as helpful because it slows us down and we get to talk about the things that maybe were out of our control that went poorly. And then we
Mm-hmm.
talk about spaces that we can build up so that that doesn't happen on race day. And so that's usually how we see it, right? It just
Yeah.
works out to be this like really organic check part. And it's hard if your athlete's not performing to the way that they think they would have liked or that you would have liked. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to an invaluable experience of like, well, that was one day and there was a lot to take from it. It's just good, tangible data.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, there needs to be an emotional connection to our why and our motivation for like doing the things, right? Like if we're signing up for races and we have no idea why we're doing it, like other people are, so we just do and we don't really have any good like inner why or reason for doing these things, there has to be an emotional place that this all kind of stems from, right? We have to have an emotional attachment to our goals, a reason for wanting to do these things. But at the same time, we also have to be really good at taking the emotion out of so much of this stuff and just treating it like data and information and being curious without judgment, because then we can, make our notes, learn what we need to learn, course correct where needed, and not make it be about like us and our worth and our value as people. So
Hmm.
it's interesting because we have to be emotional about it in order to be motivated and driven, but we have to be unemotional about it in order to improve.
That's right. So listeners, here's a good example of how you might translate that, right? For all of us who aren't in a coaching and don't have years of running under our
Mhm.
belts, right? You show up to a local 5K and your insides are just tweaking, right? The anxiety is high, right? You've got a number in your mind. Using that as a tune-up before your key race, like you were saying, takes some of the performance pieces out of it,
Mhm.
and now it just becomes a fun run,
Yeah.
right? And so you're like, hey, instead of getting, like, how do we practice showing up in a way that's like strictly for us,
Mhm.
right? Like maybe it's just, hey, go run and pace a buddy, right? So you got the
Yep.
experience without all the stress. Or maybe it becomes like, hey, like we're going to this 5K so that you can just see it and like be part of the community and like lower the stakes,
Yeah.
right? And
Totally.
that just does so much for us later, right? Where we're not in our head about numbers at all because you took the numbers out of the equation
Yep.
altogether, right? It just became an experience, just a touch point.
Yeah,
That makes sense?
exactly. Absolutely. And it's funny because I'm thinking about like my own personal race experience last couple of years when you sort of mentioned that. I had a very interesting couple of years of racing going back to like 2022. I had dental surgery a couple days before a race. And then my next race, I had just found out that I was pregnant. And so I had a couple of races where I was expecting. So yeah, you have to just take like numbers. Like you're just showing up and hoping you make it to the finish line kind of thing. So I had like a few years of races that were just like, I'm just here just to participate and like it is what it is. But it was so much fun. Like I've never felt so at ease with racing and enjoyed being out there and just taking all of that pressure off of myself to perform at a certain level or a certain way. And it was really interesting that I had just wonky timing of things that happened, that it just, was lining up with all these events that I had signed up for. But now I have no excuse. This year I got to get back into it, for realsies. I'm over a year after having my kids, so I can't use that as an excuse anymore. So, okay, Steph's got to get serious. But I do encourage anybody listening to even for like not just one race, but for like a season of racing or a year of racing, like, yeah, just go into it with your only goal to be to like show up and have a good time, because it is a wonderful thing to experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like being in the passenger seat,
Yeah.
going on a drive that you do all the time. You're like, oh, I've never noticed this and this and this. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, totally. Totally. So 10 out of 10 would recommend, but you don't need to get your wisdom teeth out in order to experience it. You can just do that without needing to get your wisdom teeth out first.
Could skip that step together.
Yeah. All right. So before we wrap up, do you have any kind of last, thoughts, advice, tips, kind of final things that you want to leave us with for today?
Make it a party.
Make it a
Have a good
party.
time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that. So where can people find you, connect with you if they happen to live in the Orlando area and want to come out to get some coaching and run with Seth? Tell us more about how they can get in touch with you.
Oh, a selfish plug. We love it. If you're
Yes.
in the Central Florida area, then you can connect with us. Just in the run scene, we historically practice Thursdays and Sundays for our blocks. We offer the blocks 3 different seasons a year, and that's just a great way of us kind of like drip feeding you like what we're all about, right? You get to connect with the coaches, meet some of our community in action in an organic way,
Mm-hmm.
and then ask questions, right? Because that's half the battle of like, well, I have questions, and maybe you can help.
Yeah.
We'd love to. And then for those of us who don't live in Central Florida, right, for you unlucky souls, you can still find us on Instagram at runBMT, and
Yeah.
we'd love to chat with you there as well.
Sounds good. And do you offer virtual coaching as well?
We do. We use
Yeah.
the
Okay.
Training Peaks app,
Oh,
like
okay.
very popular. Yep.
Yep. Okay. Fantastic. And do you have a website as well? You mentioned your Instagram.
That's right. We're on Instagram. We do have a website. It's
Yep.
blackmattertraining.com.
All right.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Seth. It has been a pleasure talking to you, sharing so much great information. I think some really good take-home advice for all the listeners and, people who just want to understand some of these intricacies of like running and training plans and timing of races and everything. I think you shared like so much really valuable stuff. So I appreciate you taking the time today to come on and share it with all of us.
Thanks again for having me. What a joy.
All right. Well, that's it for this week's episode, everyone. I want to thank you so much for listening. And I hope that you got a lot of great info out of this conversation. And of course, we will see you right back here next week for another new episode of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.